All right, so as Matt mentioned, my name is Kayci Vickers, and I am a postdoctoral fellow and licensed clinical neuropsychologist here at Emory. So within the cognitive empowerment program, I'm a coach, and I'm also one of the cognitive training, I help lead some of the cognitive training classes. So today what I'm going to be talking about are strategies to optimize something called executive functioning. Now, if you haven't heard this term, don't worry. We're going to talk about what it means, as well as talk through some practical strategies for folks to improve this, especially focusing on people who have mild cognitive impairment or dementia. But also, what I'll talk about today are strategies that really anyone can use. All right, so first off, why don't we talk about what executive functioning is? So kind of broadly, this is an umbrella term that really speaks to some of the super high level things that our brain does. So when you hear executive functioning, that actually refers to different high level functions that affect our ability to appropriately respond with our environment. So basically anything where we're interacting with our environment, we're interacting with other people, executive functioning is involved in that. Now, practically, that means that it is sort of encompasses things like problem solving, judgment, planning, organization, and decision making. And so these are really big kind of ideas. These are really big things that our brain does. I always like to think of our executive functioning as sort of the director or the conductor of the brain. So if you think about something like decision making, there's not one part of our brain that's doing that, right? There's a whole lot of pieces of our brain that have to work together to make a good decision. And our executive functioning is that piece that's actually kind of conducting where all of those things go and making sure that the product is what we want it to be. So executive functioning is really, really important. Now, when we talk about the brain itself, this is typically related to a place in the brain called the frontal lobe. So if you look at the picture to the right here, you'll see that that sort of orange-red part of the brain that's lit up is right here behind your forehead, and that's called the frontal lobe. So part of the reason executive functioning is this big umbrella term is because it encompasses almost everything that the frontal lobe does. So there's a lot of different pieces to what we're talking about when we say executive functioning. What's also really cool is the frontal lobe in humans is proportionally a lot bigger than other animals. So we're kind of designed to be doing these high level functions, things like problem solving and decision making. Now, if someone has damage to the frontal lobe or it's compromised due to an underlying dementia or something like that, you can see some problems. So you can see things like disinhibition, so sort of losing your filter or having trouble kind of hitting the brakes if you want to have a response. Poor planning and organization, poor judgment of situations or poor insight, poor attention, and sometimes you can even see some changes in mood or difficulties with regulating your mood, as well as some small changes in personality. So when people do have difficulties with executive functioning, a lot of times care partners or other people in their life really notice these changes because it can kind of feel like the person themselves is changing. And that's something that's really important to know because that can be a place where it's really key to say, okay, this is the disease, this is something that's going on in this person's brain, it's not the person. And that can be really difficult to do with some frontal lobe disorders. Now, on a smaller scale, it's also important to know that even when your frontal lobes are totally normal, people have fluctuations in executive functioning performance. We see declines in decision-making and problem-solving if people are sleep deprived. So if you're not getting good sleep, that can really impact how well you're able to do those high-level functions. We see changes when people are stressed out. So especially if you're under chronic stress, that can really impact this type of functioning. Distractors in your environment can have a huge impact on your ability to maintain executive functioning. And things like depression and anxiety, especially if they go untreated, can really impact your executive functioning skills. So it's important just to keep in mind that executive functioning difficulties exist on a spectrum, and most of us experience at least mild difficulties at some point in our life. And some people experience those really severe difficulties that we see with changes due to dementia or other things that can impact our brains. All right, so I know this isn't interactive, but I always like to kind of have people think about how this might apply to them. And the first thing I want people to kind of think about is how their own decision-making and problem-solving processes have changed over time. So one of the things that we want to kind of keep in mind, especially about executive functioning, is that this can change over our lifetime. So if you think about how you solved problems or made decisions when you were a teenager versus when you were, 30 years old versus 60 years old, there's a lot of changes that can happen there. Now, some people may have a consistent strategy from, for their whole life, but even folks that are kind of keeping that consistent strategy are probably noticing that they have more experience, they have more exposure to different types of problems, which can really help people later on in life. Now, the flip side of that is that as we get older, our brains kind of slow down a little bit. So it can be hard to kind of handle quick decisions or to handle curveballs. And we really benefit from having a little more time, even if we have all of that experience. So something to think about. Now, the sort of additional layer here is if people are having cognitive changes due to MCI or dementia, that can drastically shift this as well. So especially if folks are having executive functioning difficulties, but even if they're having other difficulties, that director can kind of have a hard time making those responses that we want. And so a lot of times what we see is that as people move into an MCI stage or a dementia stage of disease, they start to kind of shift some of those responsibilities to the partner. And that's something that is certainly not a bad thing. It's just something to be aware of in your relationship. All right, so today what we're going to focus on are some strategies for how we can improve executive functioning. And I find it sort of easier to talk about this if we pick a type of executive functioning. So today, I'm going to talk mostly about decision making, but the strategies that we'll talk about apply to sort of any part of executive functioning. So anytime you're doing these high-level tasks, problem solving, planning, organization, these strategies will be helpful. And the other thing to know is that these tips will be helpful for anyone. Any of us can benefit from these tips, but they become really critical for people that are having those cognitive changes. So if you think about, having declines in executive functioning, we want to really put in place safeguards to make it sort of as easy as possible to optimize our executive function. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So again, these tips are great for anyone. Don't feel like you can't implement them. But they are things that become really, really important for folks that are having cognitive difficulties. So for anyone who has taken our CEP classes, you've seen these boxes before. You've heard me talk at length about this model. And so these are kind of the basics of how we want to compensate for difficulties. And this applies to memory, it applies to executive function. But today we're going to really hone in on how this applies to executive function, and we're going to talk about decision-making in particular. So anytime we want to improve our executive functioning, we want to first optimize our attention. Our brains cannot do high-level processing if we're not paying attention. And then we want to be intentional. Now, when we talk about being intentional, that's a really kind of big topic, right? So it's hard to kind of be intentional. So I'm going to give you guys some tips that really focus in on what we mean by be intentional for executive function. But first, we'll talk about optimizing attention and some practical ways to really help with that. All right, so before we jump in, and I think this is actually a really good thing. Hopefully none of this is going to be groundbreaking, right? These are things that are practical, but we don't always kind of put them into place. So what I always tell people is take what's helpful for you, kind of leave the rest. But know that if you are either working with someone who has cognitive difficulties, if you are someone who has cognitive difficulties, these are kind of tried and true ways to really help boost that executive functioning, that problem solving, that decision making. So the first tip is to not multitask. So don't multitask, monotask. So a lot of us in our daily lives are doing at least 2 or 3 things at once, right? So you're, maybe you're waiting on a phone call, you're cooking dinner, you're watching TV, maybe you're having a conversation with someone in the room. And for the most part, people are able to kind of keep up with that pretty well. But what happens when we do that is our attention to any one of those tasks is worse. So we may not feel that effect until we get thrown a curveball or until we make a mistake. And then, it's kind of harder to recover if you are multitasking. So because that really stretches our resources and stretches our attention, if we need to pay good attention, if we need to really be focusing in on those executive functioning skills, we want to do what's called monotasking, which is working on one thing, finishing it, and then moving on to the next thing. So in the example I gave a minute ago, if you're cooking dinner, you want to, and that's something you might have trouble with, you want to turn off the TV, try not to have conversations, and you want to just be focused on cooking dinner. And then afterwards, you can turn the TV back on or have those conversations. So monotasking can be really, really powerful. The next sort of practical tip for optimizing attention is to set up your environment for success. So this is another one that if you've taken any of the CEP classes with me, I drill this in. One of the most powerful things we can do to help with attention and executive functioning is to set up that environment to kind of give us the biggest boost we can in executive functioning. So in order to do this, the first thing you want to think about is distractors and interrupters, right? So what are those things in your environment where you plan to do any sort of decision-making task or solve problems, have important conversations? What are those things that are going to get in your way? What are those things that are going to distract you? And something that comes up time and time again is clutter. So if you look at the screen, or excuse me, if you look at the picture here at the bottom, we've got the same office. I pulled this off the internet. This is no one's home, I hope. But you can look at this office on the left and on the right. On the left, there's stuff everywhere. There are things, cute little like toys and stuff. And on the right, it's clean. Everything kind of has a place. Now, this can be important because imagine, you get a really important call from your doctor and you need to take notes and maybe you're not sure of everything they're saying and you want to make sure that you get everything down. Going into the first office on the left, it may be kind of hard to do that, right? You don't really have access to your computer. There's no space for you to be able to put that notepad down. Maybe it's hard to find the notepad. On the right, you're able to just go in and do that task. So we want to be thinking about things like that. Additionally, when we're thinking about setting up our environment, again, we want to think about reducing distractions, reducing interruptions. So doing things like turning our phone off, closing the door, maybe putting a do not disturb sign on if it's something that we really need to focus on. But we also want to think about things like tiredness. So it's really hard to be kind of at our best when we're feeling tired, or if we're in an environment that makes us sleepy. So, using things like caffeine or even just getting up and taking a brisk walk can be really helpful. And then the last piece you want to think about, which I kind of touched on already, is sort of having everything you need in one place. So that can keep you from getting distracted, right? You don't have to go find your notepad. It's right there for you. All right. So the next tip for optimizing that attention, and so the next tip is to actually practice. So what we know is that people's ability to focus actually improves if they practice it. So one of the sort of best examples of this is something called mindfulness meditation. People who practice mindfulness meditation, because it has a very similar quality to that sort of focused attention, tend to see a strengthening of that ability to focus when they need to. Now, you don't have to do mindfulness meditation to get that effect. Anything where you're really actively focusing for prolonged periods of time can be helpful. So things like playing an instrument, learning to play an instrument, reading a book, playing sports where you're really focused, those types of things can really kind of or train your mind to be more focused and to be able to kind of call that up when you want to. With this, it really helps to make it a routine. So you can practice actually doing these high attention activities for 20 or 30 minutes a day. Doing that at the same time in the same place can help actually train your brain for better attention. So we call this an attention space. And the idea is that when you kind of train your brain that every time I go to my office, I'm paying attention and focused, I'm going to do those high executive functioning activities, your brain gets used to it. So the next time you go there, you're ready, you're kind of in set. And then the last thing I always like to bring up with attention is knowing your own blind spots. So there are always going to be times where we do not pay good attention, right? So I'm a notoriously bad morning person. And if you look at the grumpy cat on the right, good morning, no such thing. So if you're someone that falls in that boat, or maybe you are a morning person and the afternoon isn't great for you, don't schedule important things at that time of day, right? If something comes up that is an important decision you need to make, hold it until that time of day where you really feel at your best, so you can really give all your resources to it. Also knowing blind spots, like things that distract you. So for example, if you're someone that gets really pulled to prompts on your phone, be really careful about taking your phone into high attention spaces. So things like driving, or if you're working on some problem, or if you're working on some decision you need to make, turn the phone off, because that can be something that really pulls your attention. I think another good example of this is grandkids. They can be really distracting, but it's a welcome distraction, right? So being able to manage, when you are actually, sort of keeping track. So making sure that you're able to pay that attention when you want to, as opposed to kind of getting distracted by them. All right. So we've talked about ways to optimize our attention, which is really that first step in improving executive function. So we always want to have that good attention. Next, we want to be intentional. Now, this can be a little more abstract, so I have some sort of key pieces here. So first, when we're being intentional, we want to actually slow down the process. So again, I'm going to focus on making decisions, but this applies to problem solving, planning, organizing, remembering to do things in the future, anything that really pulls on those executive functioning resources. So we want to slow down the process first and foremost. We want to collaborate, and we want to create a record. And I'll explain what all these mean. So first, slowing down the process. So this is basically what it sounds like, right? We want to kind of pump the brakes and make sure that we give ourselves enough time to really work through a problem or a decision. When doing this, it's really important to keep in mind that if a problem or a decision is new, complex, or if it's especially emotional for us, we have to expect that that's going to take us more time. So just knowing that going in can be helpful, because you can sort of say to yourself, okay, this is a problem I've never solved before. I'm going to need to spend a little more time doing it. We also want to kind of make a shift, and our goal should be more about the quality of our decision rather than making a quick decision. So again, this idea of slowing down that process to give ourselves time to really think through things and really give ourselves that time and space to process something. So it's important to keep in mind that very few problems in the real world have to be solved immediately. So there are things that may need to be solved quickly, but most things you can at least take a pause and really figure out how you want to respond. So some practical ways just to slow down in the moment. So let's say someone asks you for an important decision and they're standing there talking to you. The first thing you can do is start by pausing and taking a few deep breaths. So this sounds really simple, but it can go a really long way. Even just, taking that moment to say, okay, I recognize this is a new problem. I'm going to take a few deep breaths before I start to think about how I want to solve it, can help you kind of get into that mindset and really improve your ability to make a good decision in that moment. If you're working through a difficult decision, so for example, if you are, figuring out a new insurance to use, that can be a really difficult process. There's a lot of things you have to read and think about. So if you are doing a problem like that, you want to take regular breaks. So, allow yourself to work on it for 30 minutes, take a break, and then either come back to it or come back to it later. But taking those breaks help kind of keep your brain fresh and allow you to really focus on that activity, and also to really kind of boost those decision-making abilities. And last but not least, kind of give yourself that space to sleep on it if possible. A lot of times, we get into this rhythm of trying to get something done, that we don't always give ourselves enough space to kind of think about something and come back to it. And especially if you're having difficulties with cognitive functioning, that's something that can be helpful. All right, so the next piece of being intentional is collaborating. So a lot of us probably do this naturally. If we're, facing an important decision, it's pretty typical that people ask for help from a friend or from someone they trust. But especially if someone's having cognitive difficulties, we want to do this really intentionally because two heads are better than one. So this doesn't always have to be the same person. It can be someone different depending on the situation. But you want to be thinking about, okay, I have this hard decision in front of me. I want to talk to someone. This could be your spouse, family member, friend, a therapist, a doctor. Again, just someone who can sort of help collaborate on that problem with you. And again, it can differ depending on the problem. So there are a couple of reasons why this can be really helpful. The first one is that it can be really hard to see other perspectives or to consider kind of all sides of a problem. Sometimes we kind of get tunnel vision, especially if we're trying to make a decision quickly, and talking to someone else, getting that other voice or their other thought on it can kind of be helpful. Other people can also add knowledge that we don't have. So this is especially true if you're trying to make like a healthcare decision or something like that. You want to work with your doctors to understand, what they know and have that inform what you're doing. And then the last piece here is that other people can actually help us compensate for our own blind spots. So it can be really hard to say to yourself, I have a hard time in the morning, so I'm not gonna kind of face this down in the morning. I'll wait until the afternoon. But a spouse or someone that lives with us might be able to really quickly recognize that you're going to make a better decision if you wait a couple of hours. So being able to kind of help us with that can also be really useful. All right, the last piece, and what I think is one of the more important pieces, is to actually create a record or to write it down. So we talk about this a ton when it comes to memory, right? If we want to remember something, it's always helpful to have notes. It's always helpful to write it down. We don't always talk about it when we're talking about decision-making and planning and problem solving. And so I want to kind of make this point because it's super important and it can be really helpful. So actually writing down our decision-making process through things like pro-cons lists, brainstorming notes, simply notes about how you've come to a decision can be really helpful because number one, it can be helpful for some people to kind of see it on paper. But number two, it gives you a way to come back to it. So let's say you're making use of that slowing down piece that I was talking about earlier. You take a break and you come back. If you have good notes, if you have a good record of where you're at, you can kind of hop right back in, as opposed to having to kind of retread the same things you've already done to figure out where you're at. It's really important when you're doing this to keep notes somewhere that can be easily accessed and referred to later. And that referred to later part is really important. We create records so that we can look back to them in the future, right? So the next time that we're saying, oh, why did I make that choice? Or what was I trying to do there? You can look back at your notes and it'll sort of tell you. You want to use a single location. So keeping a journal for decisions or keeping this in a calendar, something like that, something that's kind of always available to you, or at least always available for you to refer back to, can be really helpful. And then I want to kind of touch on this because, we tend to do this really naturally for things like planning and organization. A lot of people keep calendars, they kind of keep their schedule in there. And that's something that feels pretty natural for most people. But we really don't do this as much for decision-making and problem solving. So I know that there are some people out there who are really tied to pro-cons lists or will, kind of keep track of that throughout the process. But a lot of people can find it really difficult to actually think about, how do I track that decision-making process? So with the rest of my time today, I want to just show you guys one strategy that we teach at CEP for decision-making, and specifically for creating a record of decision-making. So we call this GOAS. It comes from a system called EON. that is a type of neurorehabilitation. So GOAS is used to keep a record of your decision-making process. And I'll kind of give you an example of this. So GOAS is an acronym, and it stands for first. So each letter stands for a piece. So G stands for stating your goal. So when you are faced with a decision that you make, the first step is actually to state your goal, to clarify your goal. And I'll show you why this is so important in just a minute. The biggest piece is just that, you can't solve a problem if you don't actually know what you're trying to solve. So that's step one. Step two is to brainstorm options. So we want to think about what are all of the possible options that I could do? How could I possibly respond? Or, what are the possible decisions that are on the table without actually judging them at this point? So you want to just get everything out. This is really brainstorming. Step three is to assess your options. So after you've done this beautiful brainstorm of all the possible things you could do, you want to go through and say, okay, these are the ones that, these are the 2 or 3 that are the best options. And this is where things like, pro-con lists or things like that can be helpful for folks. And then the S in GOAS stands for select. So that last step is taking that 2 or 3 that you got down to and saying, okay, this is the one. And what's powerful about this is, one, it's systematic. So you have to follow these steps in order, and it gives you that structure, right? So it kind of tells you how to go through the process. But 2, you're supposed to write these down as you go. So writing them down in this order, again, kind of gives you that way to look back and say, okay, this was my goal. These were all the things I was thinking of. I narrowed it down to these couple, and then I chose this last one because, you write in the reason. So let me show you how this works. And so I like to use this example because I think most people, this is a decision we all have to make most days. What do you want to eat for dinner? It's a really silly example. This obviously applies to much bigger things, but this is something, again, that we all kind of face every day. So if we're using GOAS, we would first state our goal. So if you're thinking about what that goal could look like, there are a lot of different goals you could have for eating dinner. Some people may want to eat a quick meal. Some people may want to eat a healthy meal. Some people may want to eat something that tastes really good. You may have family in town that you want to impress. So you want to think about, what that goal actually is for you and be very specific, because that's going to impact how you choose your options. So next we have options. This is where we're just brainstorming all of those ideas. I only put 3 on the slide here, but if you were doing this in real life, you would write out as many as you need to. So you can imagine if you're trying to decide on, whether you're going to sell your house, this options list is probably going to be pretty big. So after we create our options, we want to actually assess those options. Hold on, I think I have a slide here with everything in. There we go. So options here might be ordering takeout, cooking at home, or eating at a restaurant. After we've written out the options, we want to assess them. So this is where we'd actually go through option by option and think, is this good? Is this bad? How much do I like this option given the current situation? So again, my goal is to decide what to eat for dinner. Maybe I've been eating a lot of takeout lately, so that ordering takeout is a little lower on the list. Maybe I would like to cook, but we don't have a recipe on hand. So cooking at home is a good option, but it may be a little bit harder. And then eating at a restaurant, going to a restaurant would be nice, but maybe you ate at a restaurant yesterday, so maybe it's a little bit lower. And again, this is where you'll actually kind of weigh these things, right? So you might be circling the ones that seem like better options, crossing out the ones that seem like worse options. And then at the end, you want to actually select your choice. And this is where, especially if you're having trouble with memory or trouble with executive functioning, you might want to actually write out why you chose what you did. And again, I want to underscore that eating dinner is kind of a silly example, a small example, but this can be applied to much bigger things. All right. So hopefully there are a couple of bits and pieces from today's talk that you guys can take and use and can be sort of a practical thing to improve your executive functioning in your daily life. But that's what I have for today. So if anyone has questions, I'm happy to answer those. or talk more about any of the pieces that we've talked about so far.
Thank you, Kayci. That was a great presentation, really helpful. And I want to reiterate what Kayci said. If you have any questions, please post them in chat and we'd love to answer them. I'd also love to hear if anyone has ever tried implementing any of these strategies before, and maybe if it was successful or not.
Thanks, Dixie.
Yeah, so Kayci, we're getting a lot of good feedback. So some people have said that they do use it all the time, so that's helpful.
Yeah. I also see example. So someone had said, I learned to use an example of goal while I was in the Army. I used it the rest of my life. So it's really interesting. I think the Army is one, but there are a couple of different industries where people actually learn very specific decision-making sort of trees. So ways that they move through decision-making, and I'm not sure who had said that comment, but just like you said, those are things that can really stick and really last. So if you are someone that's having any difficulties with decision-making, or having some new cognitive difficulties that you're dealing with, I actually really encourage people to kind of take stock of those things that used to work for them, because sometimes we can bring back those habits that maybe we haven't used in a while, and they can be really powerful because there's something that we feel really comfortable with. So that's a really great example. Thank you for putting that in the chat.
Also, Kayci, we had a question come in. They asked, when discussing, do you get new ideas that alter your original plan?
Yeah, that's absolutely possible. So I think what I'm taking from this, which is, please write it in the chat for me, but I think that's part of what's so great about that collaborating piece, right? Is that we don't always see all of our options. So what I recommend to people is, if you are using GOAS as a sort of structure, you can sort of either you can work with someone through the whole process, or you can set your goal, you can work through some of the options you see, and then actually collaborate on that, so you can kind of get new ideas and get some new thoughts in there. But absolutely, those things can change throughout the decision-making process. So if you are having difficulties with executive functioning, you just want to kind of document that, right? So maybe when someone else is helping you with a piece, you use a different pen color or something to just kind of remind yourself of what that process has looked like. But it's never a bad thing it's rarely a bad thing to have kind of that new insight and new ideas, but it can change as you're going. Good question.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people really related to the what to decide to eat for dinner. I think everyone seems to have that problem, but obviously, these strategies can be used for all different types of decision making.
Yeah. And that's something too to keep in mind. I was looking through the chat just now. It seems like, folks feel like this could be sort of a practical way to, especially GOAS can be sort of a practical, simple thing to implement. And what I would say is that is very true. That's part of why we use it. But then the other thing with that too is that the more you practice it, kind of the easier it gets. So it's something where at first it might feel a little burdensome. But as you're practicing it and as you get into that habit, folks start to see that it comes pretty naturally after you get used to the different pieces.
Yeah, and that kind of speaks to one of our attendees, where they mentioned that they've been using it since they were in the Army for decades now. So. Does anyone have any other questions or comments about how maybe how to implement this into your daily life, or any other strategies that people find helpful? Or does anyone have any ideas on maybe an extra difficult situation where using a strategy like this might be helpful to think through? Kayci, we had a question come in. Someone was saying that that sometimes people report having anxiety when there's like an important decision to be made, and sometimes it's hard to like take it slow, and it can be tempting to make a hasty choice. Do you have any recommendations on kind of like being able to slow down and think through these processes that we talked about?
It's a really good point. So this is actually where that's part of that slow down piece comes in, right? So we as people, not as people with cognitive impairment, just as people, are not great at making hasty decisions. That's just how it is. If we're making a hasty decision, we're often not considering all those options. And it can be really sort of, I understand that piece of, feeling anxiety about it. So what I usually recommend to people is that regardless of what the decision is, practice always taking a pause. So even if it's something simple, like let's say it is something like, what do you want to have for dinner? Recognize that that's a decision you make. That's something you have to actually decide. Take that moment, take a couple of deep breaths, and then start thinking about the problem. So give yourself that opportunity to take a pause, because that can really sort of actually slow down that decision-making process without it being too burdensome, right? So it's not something where you have to draw it out necessarily, but it gives you that second to kind of take a beat, reduce that anxiety a little bit, and move forward. The other thing I'll say about that too is that, when we're talking about the brain and where executive functioning sort of lives, things like anxiety and stress kind of take away from those resources. So as much as we can, we want to reduce anxiety around decision-making, around problem solving. We want to reduce stress around those situations. So we want to really be mindful about that. If we are making important decisions, we want to try to reduce the stress, reduce the anxiety around it. Obviously, that's not always possible, especially if it's something we're really emotionally invested in, but it's something to be aware of. And if you notice that anxiety or that, if you're feeling kind of too emotional about it, let yourself step away from it and come back.
Yeah. Kayci, we also got another question come in. Someone was asking, is it best to discuss a topic before making a decision rather than to make it and see if it kind of aligns with what other people are thinking? I think this is very situational dependent. Obviously, like in an emergency situation, it's important to act quickly. So maybe a discussion beforehand would be bad, but do you have any tips on like a speedy decision versus like a slow decision?
Yeah. So I think that's exactly right. If you are in an emergency situation, there are going to be times where you do actually have to decide immediately. But I think in general, being able to have a discussion about something is helpful, especially if you know that this is something that's hard for you. So if you know that you're having some trouble with judgment or with decision making, this is a time that you would want to say, I really would like to get someone else's opinion on this. What I will also say about that is that, you can also have those discussions ahead of time, right? So this is where, if you know that this is something that's hard for you, or you have a loved one that you're concerned that this is something that's hard for them, you can have some of those discussions ahead of time and put things in place to kind of scaffold that. So for example, if you're concerned that someone may get into a car accident and not be sure, who to call, go ahead and write that out on a piece of paper that they can just access, right? So you can kind of take that piece out. But that's how I would say, to think about those discussions is that ideal state is that you're making that decision, you're discussing with someone. If you can't do that, or if there are situations that you won't be able to do that, you can maybe discuss them ahead of time and have a plan in place.
Similarly to that idea of making decisions ahead of time and creating scaffolding to make decisions easier later, someone also mentioned that Dr. Law likes to recommend that people put things in important things in very specific places that they can go back to, because then there's no decision making. I know where, if I always put my keys on the little hook next to the door, there's very little decision making or executive functioning or planning that needs to be involved. It's just I always know it's there. So yeah, like always putting things in the same place can kind of set yourself, you're kind of doing yourself a favor for the future. I think that can be really
Dr. Law is a very smart man. So the other thing to think about here is also that can be true of kind of anything that you create a routine out of. So that's part of why, especially folks that have been with me in classes, you hear me just talk about make something routine, because the less you have to make those decisions, the less you have to think about it, kind of the better, right? As long as it's something that you don't need to really deliberate about. If it's something like, am I taking the car or am I walking? You want to have the keys there ready for you.
Yeah. So we had a few other comments come in. People were just kind of describing different types of situations where they use this kind of decision-making technique. And it can be helpful in all kinds of scenarios. So people were saying making like large purchases, like if they wanted to purchase a car or some sort of like appliance. Someone also mentioned how it can be really helpful in troubleshooting a computer. As someone who helps the team with computer issues, I can say that, yeah, trying to slow down, be methodical, and think about those different types of decisions can definitely help with any sort of computer issues.
So I don't usually mention this in these talks, but something else too, if folks are interested in this like sort of fast versus slow decision making, there is a book out there called Thinking Fast and Slow. I think it's by Daniel Kahneman, and like, that it's kind of the same idea, right? That like when we make those snap decisions, those snap judgments, we kind of get tunnel vision. We don't always see all of our options. We don't always see sometimes the best option. And so kind of being able to slow down that decision making and get into what we call sort of system 2 processing allows you to really use all of your resources and really, really kind of gives you better decisions in the long run.
Yeah. Does anyone have any other questions or comments when they like to use these strategies, or any experience with using these strategies? Please post them in chat or in the Q&A. Kayci, can you repeat? I forget how do you spell?
I put it in the chat.
There you go. For Danny Kahneman.
I think that's right. Let me just make sure. Yeah, Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. So that's a really interesting book just about how the difference between our snap judgments and our really thought out decisions, and how we can actually move things from that fast decision making into slow decision making. And it's certainly not written about folks that are having cognitive impairments, but it applies. So anytime we can take stuff out of that fast system 1 and move it into system 2, the better.
Okay. Well, I don't see any more questions or comments coming in. If that's the case, then we can begin wrapping up a little bit early. Kayci, I really want to thank you for coming on. This was like a really great discussion. Everyone seemed to really enjoy it. It seems like, I hope. If anyone has any last
minute questions. Thanks for your great questions.
Yeah.
Great questions.
Yeah, if anyone has any last minute questions, please post them in chat. Otherwise, I'm going to look up who is scheduled to be with us for next week. I believe next week is going to be a workout. Yes, so we're going to be joined by our Get Active team. So that is either going to be Ayatoni Ario or Mark Bodner, and there are 2 great research physiologists, and we're going to be doing a workout. They always do like such a great job of working out people's bodies and minds, so I hope everyone can come join us next week for that. Yeah, so thank you all for coming. If, like I said, if we don't have any other questions and we can end a little bit early, If people want to drop off now, then I think that's going to be okay. But otherwise, I'll keep the link open just for a few minutes if anyone has any last minute things. And yeah, see you guys all next week. Bye, everyone.